Hi everyone. So this is part two of the Cask of Amontillado. We'll be talking about setting, symbols, and then a final slide with some comments about the narrator, Montresor, at the end of the story. So the setting. Um, it is set in Italy, as I mentioned before, probably around the 15th or 16th century. But mostly that matters because of the carnival setting. There are a lot of reasons for the inclusion of the carnival setting in the story. We already talked about Fortunato as a fool, as a jester, which in itself is ironic because his name has the word fortune in it. So, how can he be a fool and fortunate at the same time? Well, he is. He also is not fortunate ultimately in the end, ironically, because he is the one who dies. The carnival setting also gives Montresor an excuse to let his servants off for the evening. He knew psychologically through the notion of reverse psychology that I had mentioned earlier, um, that when he told his servants to stay at the house and that he would be out, that they would actually leave. Of course, that's human nature, but that's one of the ideas of this story is to explore the dark side of human nature. And so the setting of the carnival provides those reasons. It also provides the reason for Fortunato to be drunk and for Montresor to have just happened upon him at the carnival, even though we know he was calculated in his decisions and determined to murder him at this time and in this place. Another part of the setting is the Gothic old style mansion with underground catacombs. So, a type of quote haunted house. I have included an image here of catacombs. This is what they would look like and still do, those that still exist, where um, bones are not buried or not even in above ground crypts, but scattered and stacked in various configurations throughout the basement. Um, the descent into underground, of course, too, is important. We have the notion of light and dark that occurs throughout the piece. They take what they call in the story flambeaux, which are just torches, lit torches that they carry as they descend into the darkened basement. Of course, we're set in a time where there's no electricity, so it is completely dark except for those flames that they carry. And at the end, what makes part of the nightmarish scenario even more nightmarish is when Montresor continually pokes his torch into the wall to make sure that Fortunato is still chained up and cannot escape. And so that notion of him being lit, but then in darkness again, symbolically represents the state that he's in, light and dark, life versus death. Next, I want to talk about a few of the symbols that I think are important in the story. I do want to start with the Amontillado because the picture here of the Amontillado, which is also the image of the first slideshow. Here are some casks of Amontillado. And the Amontillado, of course, is not just wine. It's a symbol of deception. It's a symbol of um, the arrogance of Fortunato, because of course we know there is no Amontillado at all. Ironically, what leads Fortunato down to the basement does not even exist. We, as the audience, know that from the beginning, because in the very first line, Montresor says that he wants to take revenge on Fortunato. And he says it in a very particular and finalistic tone. He says, I had borne as best I could. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could. So he took them until he couldn't anymore. But when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. At length I would be avenged, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. So he would be avenged without risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity, which means his revenge would be final. He would have no consequences for his revenge. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. So he's doing this in a very cool, formal manner so that he will not be caught. Thus, we know from the very beginning that the Amontillado is a signal of that coolness, that calculatedness. The jester hat we talked about earlier with regard to Fortunato, and that is a symbol of his foolishness. The bells that ring, both sadly and happily, showcase the different emotions that Fortunato certainly is experiencing. Montresor puts on a cloak. It's called a roquelaire in the story. It's a black cloak, and that cloak almost becomes this symbol of death. Not that Fortunato would notice, first of all, because of his pride, because of his excessive pride, his hubris, and also because of his drunken stupor that he's in. But the cloak has that dark, evil significance to it that when he puts it on, Montresor, both mentally and physically, then becomes the villain of the story. The trowel produced by Montresor, when they have the conversation about the Masons and the fact that Montresor is not a member of the Masons, which at that time, as I had mentioned earlier, was a group of elite, wealthy men, a kind of secret society. Some people even believe that Masons have elements of supernatural involved in some of their secret ceremonies. And when Fortunato asked if he was a Mason and Montresor did not understand, he produced this trowel. And so the trowel has that double entendre to it. The idea of a Mason being that member of the secret brotherhood that Montresor is not a part of, as well as someone who is a bricklayer. He carried the trowel with him. Now, couldn't he have kept the trowel down where he kept the chains and presumably the concrete that he was using to build up the stones for the wall? Well, certainly he could have, but having the trowel beneath his roquelaire provides that symbolic gesture to Fortunato, who of course doesn't understand what he means at the moment. And then finally we have the Montresor coat of arms, and somebody has actually done a reproduction of what it would look like. And we know the family coat of arms, when he asks about that, is when a family back in those days was very wealthy and elite and had a long generational history. They did have a coat of arms that would represent their clan, their family generationally, distinguishing them, differentiating them from other families. And so the Montresor family coat of arms, as we can see on page 84, a huge human foot door in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. So a golden foot on top of the serpent. And the motto is, "No one provokes me with impunity." So who is who here? Well, certainly the foot of gold is Fortunato, because he's stepping supposedly on the snake and therefore killing him. He's in charge. The human, of course, can beat the animal. And yet, what does the snake do? He kills by putting his fangs inside the human's heel. So that coat of arms is ironic and symbolic both, because we know that Fortunato, and this is also an element of foreshadowing, because Fortunato is about to be killed by Montresor. So here's Montresor the snake. Here is the foot of Fortunato being poisoned by the snake, i.e. killed by Montresor himself. And finally, here's the final page that I always like to look at the very end of a story to see what kind of closure we can get. So the question we might ask based on some of the dialogue from the end of the story is, does Montresor have a conscience? Some suggest that the line near the end of the story where Montresor says, I hesitated, I trembled, as he is laying the bricks, is a sign that he feels guilt. However, what you read immediately afterwards shows that he's only happy that the wall is solid. He says, unsheathing my rapier, which is his sword, his short knife type sword, I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. So at that moment, did he hesitate and tremble because he felt guilt? In my mind, no, but there are other elements of the story that could lead to that possibility. Later, he says, my heart grew sick. And that's at the bottom of page 86. Is that guilt? My heart grew sick. And that could be emotionally, spiritually, or it could be physically. It could be all of those. But the line immediately afterwards says, it was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. So some people suggest that he is feeling a moment of regret, a moment where his conscience is leaping forward. My heart felt sick. And then he immediately covers it up by saying it was the dampness of the catacombs. One could also say, my heart grew sick physically. Maybe he's just thinking of my heart growing sick as a metaphor for him feeling awful because he's down in the damp catacombs where there's no light and it's just a physically sick feeling. So again, there's a lot that can be read into and inferred in the language as long as you analyze it to assess whether or not he's guilty. The final line is the Latin in pace requiescat, or may he rest in peace. Is that ironic? So does he mean exactly the opposite? May you not rest in peace, because he still hates him 50 years later for insulting him? Or is there a moment of peace there? It is in italics. It does have an exclamation point. Either of those could be ironic or regret. And taken with all of those lines at the end, I think Poe intended it to be ambiguous. We're not exactly sure. And we could make a case either way, or we could be content with the fact that we must remain unsure.